Welcome friends to another IC Knowledge Bureau Fireside Chat. Today is a conversation I have been looking forward to having, I have to tell you, for the better part of a year. This conversation about education, our education system, what are the global education trends, what world are we in, what does the world look like in future, and perhaps more importantly, what role can you and I play as citizens and concerned parties in South Africa about framing and contextualizing the education question for the future, specifically for the young people who are beneficiaries of that education system, but also who intend to enter the mainstream economy. To help me in having this conversation, I'm joined by Shaeera Kalla. You know her as the young lady who was an activist with Fees Must Fall. She was a former University of Witwatersrand student leader, and today she runs a fantastic platform called Mbegu Platform. Second, I'm joined by Nosipho, who is Nosipho Damasane. She is the CEO of NS Enterprises. She was also a former vice president at Sasol, where she looked after one of the main functions in Sasol Global Business. And she's also a chairman of the Richards Bay Coal Terminal. And finally, Mahlubi Mabizela, who's the Chief Director, University Education Policy and Development at the Department of Higher Education and Training. So those are the people who join us for this conversation. Now, let's dance. To set the context, unemployment in South Africa sits just north of 27%. Without question, the people who are most affected by unemployment are young people, specifically young black Africans. It has nuances across the other racial lines, but those are the main people who are affected by the unemployment question. So on the one end, you've got the education system that says we're generating these young people and we're creating these young people who are educated. On the other, young people who are saying we can't find employment. And in the middle, business that's saying where are the young people for us to employ? The reason we're having this conversation is to contextualize why we are where we are and what needs to happen. I want to start here, if I may, Shaeera, with you. So the first time you and I met, you wouldn't remember, because I was at the back of a queue somewhere and the sun was blistering hot. That day we were marching, of course, as you know, to the union buildings. I joined in solidarity. I was not a student at the time, but as a person who had been financially excluded, I got what you were fighting for. Has the education system moved at all materially since that day?
When we talk about the progress that's been made, we need to be very cautious. And I say this because whilst the movements that we fought managed to put higher education and education in general on the national agenda, there still is a long way to go in realizing the goals for a decolonized and decommodified education system. Materially, what's happened is that there has been an announcement, but many of us understand that this announcement was politically motivated, and therefore the sufficient responses to kind of institute what was announced sustainably have not necessarily been created by the state. So on the one hand, we have universities that have been supposedly given more money, and on the other hand, we have a university curriculum that has not necessarily developed in the way that it needs to address the growing concerns and the growing needs of a developmental state, a developmental economy. And so what I think is very important is for us to now not just focus our attention on what needs to fall, because we know that, but what needs to rise.
Can I ask this question, and I'll move on to our other guests in a minute, but I think it's important in the context of this conversation, because we are going to look at the past as we are, then we'll frame where we are in the present and what the future looks like. But just help me understand, when you use a word like decolonized education, for a layperson, what is a decolonized education? What does it look like? One. Two, for the person watching this, help us understand it. What was the broader struggle?
I think the most basic level of a decolonial movement in a country like ours, in a continent like ours, in a context like ours, is for inclusivity and for representation at all levels, in all spaces. What's been very clear and apparent for young people at universities, and even some of the best universities in the continent, like UCT, for example, is that you are supposedly a born free. You are supposedly in a democratic South Africa. But the struggles that you face and the structures that are built in this education system have constantly worked against you. So for example, at our universities, there's a 50% dropout rate for first years. Right? That shows you...
Did you say 50%?
Yes. That shows you that the system itself is not working for the students that it needs to work for. And there are multiple reasons for this. We can look at the fact that our basic education system is also not necessarily preparing students for the higher education system.
Right.
But fundamentally, there are many barriers within the higher education system that are also financial and not just related to the curriculum. So, for example, if you look at the NSFA system, which is the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, it's the main administrator of funds for students at universities.
Right.
But the funds are not always administered efficiently, which means that a student is not necessarily just fighting to pass, but they're fighting to survive. And if you can't survive in that system, how do you possibly pass? So we need to look at this much more holistically. And for me, that's why it's important when we talk about fees must fall, that we also talk about roads must fall. When we talk about decommodification, we also talk about decolonization, because the two cannot exist without the other.
Mahlubi, where did it go wrong?
If I would then pinpoint it to where it went wrong, I would say that the system wasn't ready. The system of distribution of the funds for the beneficiaries of free education wasn't ready to do that. And therefore, it slowly started to collapse.
I understand.
And to a point that where now it's on administration, under administration.
So for me, there's something here that's missing, which is 2015, young people go to the doorstep of the president. They didn't march to a municipality. They went to the doorstep of where the president sits every day and runs the country, right? I mean, it is the equivalent to, in any corporation, those at the lowest part of the organization going to the doorstep of the office of the CEO and saying, these are the issues we have. 3 years later, the system isn't ready. I don't mean to be coy, but my reading of it is that there was no anticipation the system was going to be changed. It seems to suggest to me that the thinking was, well, let them strike, let that happen, but they'll stop. Because after 3 years, surely somebody has gone, when this thing takes effect, these are the measures we need to have in place so that this does not happen. How was this almost, it's 36-month opportunity lost in readying the system?
Not entirely. You see, the thing is that when 2015, the March, and then there's an announcement that in 2016, the suspension of increases of fees.
Yes.
So then that came into effect, but then it had its own negatives.
Right.
Because you see that blanket announcement was done without proper planning. Then that blanket announcement meant that even the students were on bursaries from companies that can afford to have multiple students in the system on bursaries. It actually then meant that those students didn't have their fees also increased. So the first part was just about dealing with that issue. First part being 2016 now, because the announcement comes in 2015, end of the year. Then 2016 working out on the, on this feasibility of introducing free education. In my hindsight now, if at least the announcement could have come, let's say about September, so that you work out the system so that the system is ready by January. Not to say that there wouldn't have been mistakes still, but at least it would have given some time for this introduction. But added to that, having the right people to introduce it. Certainly, again, in hindsight, it actually shows that to some extent we didn't have the right people in the system, and hence now the system of NSFAS in particular is on stilts, as it were, because it's under administration. To some extent, to me, it says, maybe we didn't have the correct people, maybe we had some correct people, right people, and but it's a system that runs throughout the country. for all the 26 universities. It's not a system that's just managed at a national level. So you've got to have right people throughout, in the national office and at the institutions, because students, that's where the coalface is, at the institutional level. So I think that's where it went wrong.
Now, see, you're going to bear the brunt of industry today.
Yeah.
So, here are the numbers. In Nigeria, out of a total unemployed population of 18.8%, 33% of that is youth. In Egypt, 9.9%, 14% youth. In Algeria, 11.1%, 26% youth. In South Africa, 27%, 63% youth. Why are you people in industry not hiring young people?
I think you see it's probably just going back to the conversation of universities and fees. And as industry, the biggest gap that we notice is that there isn't proper consultation in terms of how we are developing the youth. What is the long-term plan of industry? With the market forces changing the way they do, at what point do we interact or interject with institutions to actually talk about the future? Because at the end of the day, when you discuss an education system of any country, you are talking about that output is going somewhere in industry, whether in the home of entrepreneurs or employees. So to answer the question, there's a disconnect, in my view, between what industry is doing and what the schools are doing. My take is that the confusion doesn't start at university, which is why the youth stats are giving you the picture you see, is that people at high school, in South Africa in particular, are looking into going to university when they finish. In the pre-apartheid, in the pre-independence regime, you actually had a lot of children going as apprentices into your ISCOs, into your South African Railways and Harbours, and those organizations. And therefore, you did not take everybody to university for whatever the degree is. So now what we start with industry is that opportunities are there and vacancies are there for young people to work, but there's a complete mismatch between what they've studied and what it is that we offer.
Again, so let's take a holistic view at this. Shaeera is a young lady who understands the struggles of young people, understands the struggles of students, and more importantly, understands the role education plays in framing a free society. Okay? Because without it, you can't achieve freedom. And in any case, if you do, the freedom it means nothing. It doesn't translate. So that's where Shaeera sits. But Mahlubi, you sit on the policy end from government's perspective, understanding the instruments that drive what's required for us to achieve this. Nosipho, you're saying industry is not getting into a conversation about what type of syllabi should be taught to young people to get them into industry. So, just a simple question. Why has this conversation not happened at any platform where the three constituencies sit and have the same conversation? Because, in my mind, if we're still talking about having access to free education, we're nowhere near talking about what does the quality of that education look like, who unlocks it, at which point, and for what purpose in industry. And I don't want to be coy, but I wonder if this is not something we should be placing squarely on the doors of industry to say, but you should be going to government and saying, actually, these are the jobs I need. These are my competencies in future. These are the skills I require going forward. Are you providing me with these skills, yes or no?
And I think you take it back to talking about platforms.
Right.
That if we have structured platforms when we talk, and this morning earlier when we were talking about at what point does industry really influence, it's at monitoring stage, it had happened. So you find that most of the industry captains are actually sitting in the monitoring place, if you like, in my view, because they only come in and sit at council. At council, we are looking at what has happened. Where do we sit in terms of maybe Senate, where you influence what it is that is actually required by industry. And other countries are doing it right. I mean, you quoted Germany earlier. Germany is one good example of doing this, because you find that because they are very much onto auto, if you think about their space, it's very much auto-related, whether it's cars, whether... So the reality of it is that the captains of industry are sitting in universities talking about what needs to happen, what's next. They sit in actually high schools and influence what kids are studying in high school. Because at the moment in South Africa, if you think about it, maybe in the continent, but South Africa in particular, all kids are chasing to be frustrated by mathematics and science because our damn belief is that I'll make it if I actually have maths and science. Yeah? That's basically what has influenced us growing up. So people are taking up a lot of careers that they will never be good at, but purely because they've got to chase maths and science and actually get in. So my argument around fees must fall has always been that, yes, fees must fall, but in what? What is the content? What is it that you want to actually give? We call it quality of education, I call it actual content. Because even before it becomes quality, we should be speaking the same language. And I think we will talk about the fact that the future doesn't look great in terms of how are we going to utilize people versus how are people being trained today.
Shaeera, in a minute I'll take your point, Shaeera, but back to you on this. So, in your mind, when, as you did, and I remember one of the interviews that was done with you, you kept making the point that this is a broad movement. We're at the forefront of it, but it's a broad movement because you can't sustain a movement of that type if it's just individualistic. But in your mind, at the time at which you were in the heat of what was being fought for, what did success look like for you guys?
I think it was very specific at that stage. So there were three main things that we wanted to address.
Yes.
And we wanted to get some kind of systematic response.
Yes.
Or plan, rather, to address them.
Yes.
Not necessarily immediately, but within a realistic time frame, given that these conversations are long overdue. I sometimes look at the few years that I've had at WITS and my years in student activism, and I wonder, how did Fees Must Fall not happen earlier? How did it not happen earlier? How did students from all over the country not come together and raise these issues earlier? And I think everyone was doing it in their own universities, but that national shutdown was something that really changed the game and that emphasized these three issues that we at WITS, for example, broadly spoke about. And the one was an end to outsourcing, because we wanted to bring together the struggle of workers at the university and the struggle of students.
If I may, I am fascinated by why you guys went after that. For me, as a strategist, there was a complete blind spot. I didn't see that coming. Why did you go after the outsourcing?
You see, at a university like WITS that is very politically conscious,
yes,
there are clear understandings of the world in which we want to live.
Yes.
And for young people, for students who study and who are exposed to this environment, you sign up in your first year to the Worker Solidarity Committee because you want to be studying, but you also don't want to be in a space where there is exploitation taking place.
I see.
And so the move for inclusivity and accessibility within higher education would not be complete without the inclusion of workers' issues. Because if we look at it, the poorest students are often coming from those
100%,
yeah. Right?
100%.
And so one of the biggest things we achieved at WITS was that the workers of students, the children of workers, can actually now study at WITS for free if they qualify.
Wow.
And that could change an entire household, an entire community. Because we didn't just see the 0% as something that we wanted. There was the 0%, there was an end to outsourcing, but there was also the call for free, decolonized, quality education. And so the end to outsourcing and the 0% were immediately realized. But the free education argument was one that would have taken a lot more consultation, a lot more thinking. And while there was a commission that dealt with some of the suggestions on how it would be implemented, it was a waste of time in many ways, a waste of resources as well. What we tend to do in South Africa is we love to talk. And so we'll create spaces where people can come and air their views and shout and scream.
And ventilate, yeah.
But when it comes to getting things done and getting a room of experts together, getting them to talk and come up with a solution, we sometimes tend to neglect that. And perhaps it's deliberate. Perhaps sometimes we don't want to solve some of the biggest challenges for whatever reason. I think that with Fees Must Fall, that is still needed. That kind of broad, not consultation, but actioning of what needs to be done with industry, with government, with students is still very much needed.
So you said it was 3. The first was the end to outsourcing. What were the other 2?
The other 2 was the 0% increase as
Right.
a symbolic commitment to free education,
Right.
and then the free quality decolonized education.
And then, and finally, and I just for our conversation as a final wrap up in this segment, and then I'll take Mahlubi's comment. At the time, I imagine you faced a lot of criticism. Not everybody supported what you guys were doing. How did you quieten the noise?
Sometimes you have to feed your focus and starve your critics. You just can't think about it too much. Of course, you have to understand that there are ideological underpinnings to some people not agreeing with free education.
Got you.
But if you believe in that, and if you believe that it will create a more just society, for me, that is the most important thing.
The reason I ask that question is I wonder, Nosipho, if that's perhaps not what's needed as a country. It's the ability to shut out what else is going on and go, what are we trying to do and what do we want to achieve? Mahlubi, you wanted to make a point earlier.
Yes, in fact, I wanted to link up the point that Nosipho was raising of chasing a qualification that you won't even achieve.
Yes.
With a high dropout rate.
Yes.
Just revise that number a little bit, but it doesn't make a difference anyway, to 40%. Dropout rate at first year level. Now, you see, that is one of the problems. Having people going for wrong qualifications just because, I've seen you as a lawyer and I want to be a lawyer, but I don't have any background that, in terms of education, that would set me up to succeed in the studies towards law.
Sure.
And then as a result, then I don't survive at university. And also that's exactly what makes many students go to universities and not to the TVET colleges. Because it's this chasing of this qualification called a degree and not this qualification called artisanship, or technician, or whatever other qualification that I would get at TVET college. And as a result, once I'm there at the university, then I don't survive because I've not been prepared for that qualification or those subjects or those courses that I want to follow. And then we get this high dropout rate, which is very costly. Now you can imagine now with the introduction of free education, it actually means that it's just going to be more costly than it has been already. And the solution, yes, career guidance to some extent, but it's just to sort our education system as well, the quality of it. And to solve the quality again, there are little bits and pieces, the teachers that we train, the curriculum that we have, the conditions of our schools, where they are. If they are doing computer science, then they must be having a computer that is operating. If they are doing sciences, they have a laboratory that is functional, and so on and so on. But to fix our education system first, so that then we have the quality of the people going for the correct qualifications at tertiary level, whether it's for the TVET colleges or it's for the universities. That of course, is easier said than done, but that is what we need to do.
That ends our first segment. When we come back, I wanted to start talking about where we are and, more importantly, what we need to do going forward. Stay tuned.